Welcome, everybody. Afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are tuning in from today. We are delighted to be partnering with Howden for today's webinar, and we're going to be talking about how to future-proof your hotel with operational resilience. I'm your host for today's webinar. My name is Eloise Hanson. I'm the editor of Boutique Hotel News. And if you're unfamiliar with the BHN brand, we are an online trade publication. We cover global boutique, lifestyle, luxury hotels, and branded residences. So I'm sure one of our speakers today can do a much better intro of Howden than I can. So I'm going to kindly hand over to Michael just to share some brief overview of what Howden is and how they support hotels. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Eloise. Appreciate it. So Howden is one of the largest insurance brokers in the world. We're British, and that I suppose that makes us a little bit different. Where a lot of our competitors are American brokers, so it's quite nice to have a British broker in the mix for that. Um, we're actually we're one of the biggest privately owned businesses in the UK as well. Our employee ownership is actually quite large. We've 30% of the business is employee owned. That puts us fifth in the UK, slightly behind John Lewis being number one. So it's quite a nice profile of business. You do feel like you're a stakeholder in the company. It's a little bit of background about Howden. We're operating about 30 years, still under the leadership of David Howden. We've recently expanded our territories. We're now in over 100 countries, and we've got quite a few staff as well. So I suppose over the years we've developed our business, whereby David wants us obviously to be quite important in our home market. So over the years we've acquired some brokers that will enable us to do everything from an SME company to the middle of the market, so larger UK businesses, all the way up to global corporates. And it's been a fun journey for us. So one of our main focuses is the hospitality sector. We're trying to do as much as we can to support every part of the sector, whereby traditionally we would have been an insurance broker. Now we're trying to expand our services to be able to cater for everything. So anything from mergers and acquisitions to debt, also risk management. So we have our own risk and resilience team. It's quite practical in nature, so they can do anything from a BCP plan right up to if you want to have help with preparing a claim, down to the practicalities of if you've got a specific issue around cyber or flood, we can help analyze and measure that as well. So I suppose that's a brief introduction to Howden. I'll hand back to you, Eloise.
Thank you so much, Michael. And more details about Howden have been popped into the chat if you would like to learn more. So just a quick overview of how today's webinar is going to run. We'll spend around 45 minutes chatting with our expert panel today. And if you do have any questions for any of our speakers, do submit these using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. I will keep my beady eyes on that chat so that I don't miss anything. I will ask those questions as and where relevant. And today's webinar is being recorded, so every registrant will receive a copy of that recording along with a written summary of the key takeaways. And if you do have time when you leave today's webinar, a very short survey will pop up on your screens. We're always looking to improve what we do here, so any feedback would be really valuable. Now, I'm just going to do a bit of scene setting. I think context is always key it highlights why we're here. And here's some headlines which show why operational resilience has become such a critical topic for hospitality leaders today. So, firstly, we're seeing increased scrutiny around guest safety and standards. So, following the Travelodge case, where a young woman was sadly sexually assaulted in her hotel room. Dozens of people have since contacted the BBC, many with evidence showing how hotel room security failures are not isolated to one company, which I think shows how an operational issue can escalate into a reputational one. And secondly, we have broader geopolitical and economic pressures where external shocks are impacting supply chains and the availability of goods that are central to operations. And again, this could quickly translate into higher prices for an industry that's already operating on tight margins. And on the next slide, these examples show the range and unpredictability of incidents that hotels may face. So we've seen fires impacting properties where teams have had to respond quickly to protect guests, and where that staff response has been recognized as critical. There are also more unusual events, such as the 25-meter freestanding aquarium that burst in a lobby at a Berlin hotel. And I think this shows that risk isn't always conventional, but the consequences can still be operationally severe. So all 400 guests of that hotel had to be evacuated, and the hotel immediately closed. And then, of course, there are climate-related events where in typically more tropical climates, you have storms and tornadoes that can cause significant structural damage and disruption to operations. So I hope that gives some idea as to why we're here and what we're going to be talking about today. A quick intro from our speakers before we dive in. I'm going to ask each to introduce themselves as per left to right as the PowerPoint slide. So, Michael, let's kick off with yourself. You've introduced Howden, but I want to hear about you, my friend. Over to you.
Thanks, Eloise. So, Michael Flynn, I'm a client director for Howden, so I'm very much client facing. I'm the hospitality lead for the UK. So I've got a direct focus on the hospitality sector, including hotels, restaurants, casinos, everything. And yeah, I've been working for Howden for the last 10 years, and I've got about 25 years experience in the insurance sector.
Thank you, Michael. Andreas, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Andreas Scriven, Senior Managing Director at Teneo. We're a professional services company that focuses on advising key decision makers, so kind of board level and C-suite, global business for the offices across the globe. And I joined probably about 9 months ago to head up our travel, hospitality, and leisure practice for the business. Prior to that, ran the hospitality and leisure practice at Deloitte for 7 years. And hotel background through and through. Studied hotel management back in the day. So can't get me away from the sector.
Nice to see you back, Andreas, for sure.
Thanks.
And Ryan, over to you. Welcome.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. My name is Ryan Bains. I'm an account director at STR. And STR, if you're not familiar, we're a data benchmarking company collecting data from over 90,000 hotels around the world, including occupancy, average daily rate, down to GoPAR and EBITDA par into the profitability piece. So really pleased to be involved and hopefully can provide some from insight from a data side.
Thank you, Ryan. And James, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Eloise, and thank you for inviting me on to the call. My name's James McComas. I'm the General Manager at Champneys Eastwell Manor Hotel and Spa. We are a 74-bed country house hotel with spa just outside Ashford in Kent. I've been around in the country house market for about 12 years now and in hospitality for just over 25. So just like Ryan, you can't get me out of it at all.
Well, all the LinkedIn profiles of our speakers are in the chat. I do encourage you all to connect, carry on today's conversation long after the webinar has finished. So I'm going to open today's webinar with a quick fire round. I'm going to ask each speaker individually to highlight in one sentence what they think is the single biggest operational risk facing hotels right now. So I want the idea, what is it? And perhaps your musings as to why. And I'm going to work backwards from the intro slide. So I'm going to kick off with James. What do you think?
Don't think I've got much of a choice, do I? No, great. Thanks, Eloise. I think operational risks, the biggest and I think most obvious one, and I'm sure the thought may be echoed throughout our conversations as we go, is IT security and connectivity. With less and less of our systems being based on great hulking machines in the basement, we are more and more reliant on the internet, more and more reliant on cloud-based operations for seemingly little parts of our day, but fundamentally, if we lose Wi-Fi now, or if our servers up at the central facility go down, or even a little bit, then the whole operation is absolutely ruined, and it's instantaneous. And even more crucially is that there's a very limited number of people within the operations normally who understand that. It's not a numbers game that you can throw bodies at to rally and solve the crisis. It comes down to a very select few of very brainy people to get you sorted out. So that's my two pennies on that.
And a good one as well. When I was pulling together my context slides, I know there's been some quite high-profile cases where systems have been hacked and guests' data have been retrieved illegally. So I'm glad someone's brought up the tech angle, and it only then makes sense to go to Ryan, who comes at this from a KPI but tech perspective to some degree. What do you think is the biggest operational risk facing hotels?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point from the technology side, and I think also the first slide that you mentioned around um, the challenges that can happen when you have a workforce that needs more, requires more training and requires much more of that, and what that all contributes to is really higher labor costs, and what that does to margin, compression of margin, and as you then invest more and more in trying to predict what's going to happen in the future and hiring higher skilled workers to do those jobs, like on the technology side or like even those that are front of house. Um, that definitely has contributed to what we've seen in terms of just compression of margins getting tighter and tighter and tighter. So I think that that's an operational risk on the data side that we've seen, particularly across the UK.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Andreas, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think I could sum it up in one word at the moment, and it's political. So I think, if we're looking at what is putting the most kind of consistent strain on businesses' bottom lines at the moment, and for some, quite frankly, starting to have a bit of an existential risk, um, where kind of top line growth has moderated to a certain degree. I think it's hard to kind of get away from some of the impact from some of the geopolitical decisions that are being taken both globally and nationally, and some of the policy shifts that I think, if I'm being polite, the industry would say we're not are not being viewed as hugely business or kind of industry friendly. So to me, it's maybe less about shock to the system versus continued erosion of profitability. And by no stretch of the imagination, I'm not implying here that some of the traditional risk areas are no longer relevant. So, you still have issues around people, power, water, connectivity, which was just mentioned, cyber, and so on. So, I think, there's those issues are still all there, but this kind of overarching political aspect is really putting pressure on bottom lines as well.
Thanks, Andreas. And Michael, closing thoughts.
From an insurance point of view, we'd class operational risk in two boxes. There's those you can actively risk transfer and through an insurance program or some other warranty or indemnity, and those that are, as Andreas says, very much kind of affecting the global landscape. So, it's a lot harder to risk transfer, the rising cost of energy. So I'd say from, globally speaking, James is absolutely right. Cyber's on the top of everybody's tongue. Everybody's thinking of cyber threat analysis and trying to get better at it. We're seeing a lot of businesses switch to kind of manual hard copies backups, which is funny because years ago everything was on the cloud and it was a lot more cost effective and safe to do so, and now we're kind of flip-flopping back to manual backups because it's just safer. And if you lose your data, or if you've got some sort of malware get into the system, you know that you can, as of last Tuesday when I backed up the tape, that's where I stand. So we see cyber being a big one, but we can never get away from a total loss. Total loss for us, for hotels, is always the biggest one. And that's why we think it's important to actually ask the question, what is the biggest operational risk? Because when you do that, it forces you to, think about it, note it, and then you can assess the risk, run various different scenarios, etc.
Thanks, Michael. And building on that, I'm gonna flip-flop back over to Andreas, because Andreas, you mentioned that, the political situation has big global and also national implications, and Michael highlighted just now about how to assess risk. But from your perspective, Andreas, how do you actually assess the likelihood and impact of a risk? And are there any practical methods that hotels can follow?
Yeah, I think it's always a bit cautious about kind of a one size fits all approach, right? Because we're talking about a wide range of different
Yeah.
businesses here and so on. But in many ways, I'd argue what you want to do is keep it simple. So, kind of start thinking about what absolutely is mission critical, what has to keep working. Then think about what could impact that, like what could stop it, right? An external event, something internally. Um, then think about how likely that may be, right? Because you can't plan for everything. So you need to kind of prioritize to a certain degree. And then I think it's also important to think about not what happens if this goes wrong on your average day, but what happens if this goes wrong on your busiest day, because you don't know when it's going to happen most likely. So you need to be ready for kind of worst case scenario. Um, and I think it's also important to realize that trying to predict with certainty is likely to be unsuccessful, right? It's much more about being prepared for a diverse set of scenarios and having a tested, flexible and kind of dynamic method to respond to any disruption. So, I think it's about kind of keeping it practical and manageable versus trying to be exhaustive, because you're never going to be able to do that. And maybe how that like practical piece looks at is, can you come up with a list of 10 to 15 things that are hugely important at your property to keep going? So, I'd always start with guest and employee life safety, right? I mean, if you're not looking after that, then what are you doing? But then, access to rooms, your systems, PMS,
Mm.
CRS, can you still make payments? What about utilities and so on? And then you go into things like food safety, payroll, etc. So I think there's, having some focus around where those kind of key areas might be, and then how much disruption can you tolerate, before you start seeing issues around that safety piece, around guest kind of trust being impacted, no longer being legally compliant, for example, or you got to think about it from a cash flow perspective as well. So, and then I think it's mapping that out against, if one of those things happens, how does it impact your people, your property, kind of plant and machinery, IT systems, etc. The list kind of keeps on going. I don't want to kind of do a kind of a cookie cutter kind of laundry list there, but and then you need to really go through a process of how do I score that, right? In terms of impact and likelihood, because as I said, you can't plan for everything. And so, something that might be high likelihood of happening, but you have some visibility on, so like a system failing, yeah, that might kind of slowly fail over time, maybe less urgent than being ready for something that just hits you out of the blue, right? So I think that kind of rating and kind of creating a matrix of how you prioritize is quite important. And now I'll contradict myself by saying living by that matrix, you shouldn't do that, right? Because I think, whilst the matrix is helpful in qualifying things, I think it's really answering two fundamental questions. One being, how fast does this thing hit me, right? How much time do I have to react? And how long does it take me to recover from it, right? So that maybe helps people prioritize a little bit as well. So, I go back to my comment around, failing on the busiest day of the year versus kind of, on a Tuesday where you have a bit more resource and ability to recover from that. So I'll pause there. Hopefully that's given a little bit of food for thought.
Yeah, it absolutely has. And I'm gonna quote you on something because it ties in quite nicely with my next question for Ryan. It's about being able to predict, and that we are probably unlikely to be able to predict with absolute certainty. So, Ryan, to take that as a backdrop to my question, is it possible to predict disruption before it happens, or does the data only reflect what's already happened when it's happened?
Yeah, and I think I've been given probably the most challenging question now because I think that I think what Andreas is mentioning is quite a big part of it because you can get so overwhelmed. And when I think about, I've been asked that question, particularly over the last month, quite a lot of, well, what can we do? What data points can we use? And candidly, as I go through and think about it, there is millions and millions of different data points that you can refer to. And I think that, your point around keeping it relatively simple, is quite good. And as an example for that, every quarter, STR, we do a forecast. And we forecast for, a number of European markets. And we released our latest forecast on something like the 27th of February.
Mm.
And then on the 28th of February is when everything was kind of started to happen across in the Middle East. So, I mean, we forecast, I always say, I don't know whether we're incredibly brave or incredibly silly to do one or the other, but the challenge that we always have is occupancy. And when you look at occupancy in ADR, it's a lagging indicator in a sense, right? So it only ever tells you what happened previously, but then you can look at some of the trends of what happens historically. One of my favorite slides that I like to use when I'm looking at it is when you overlay occupancy, for example, over the course of last year. And there was a slide where when you overlay occupancy week over week with 2025 against a similar calendar year of 2014, it was almost exactly the same. So those long-term trends,
Mm.
particularly from an occupancy side, do, for the most part, always end up going back into the same place. But then some of the factors that that you take into account are what, positively, what events are happening and what's been the long-term historical trends of that, and then forward-looking data when it comes to business on the books. Of course, brands, when they talk about their business on the books, for example, in the UK, or in London in particular, over the next 90 days, we're pacing about 2% behind where we were last year. That
Okay.
actually, when you think about how short those booking windows are, as you mentioned, that booking window gets shorter and shorter and shorter, that actually you do end up by the time that day comes to be pretty much on level with where you anticipated. But then, of course, there's always loads, of course, for panic when you see that number of being so far behind. But I think tracking those changing patterns of guest behavior is definitely really, important. And then just looking about how much that swings. So, considering you versus the comp set and how your index is. If there's a big, big swing against your comp set, certainly then you know that over the course of the last week, I've been getting further and further and further away. Just having that more granular detail on the KPIs that you know how they're derived can
Mm.
then be quite powerful to try to predict something that can happen in the future, but it all does come in a pretty challenging way.
And can the data be used to spot vulnerabilities, to spot gaps for improvement, before it evolves into a crisis?
Yeah, and I think that really, like I said, taking that quite granular look of similar events, and whilst what we say, at the moment is quite unprecedented, taking something that can be relatively similar as you can get, and trying to analyze the impact
Mm.
with some of the factors of guest behavior changing and demand patterns changing. What was the impact? And as you said, on your busiest day, will then
Mm.
be able to, particularly, against your comp set, what did that do for my rate and how did that affect my per available room? and per occupied room figures to try and get to a place where you can understand it.
hmm Thanks, Ryan. So we're now going to bring this into, well, what we've discussed so far into a very real living lens. And I'm going to come over to James and ask you to very kindly tell us about a moment of real disruption that you have faced. So what was it that hit you and what did you do?
Sure thing. So I'm going to talk about water.
Okay.
Water. Anybody who was paying attention to the news, particularly around Christmas, will know that Southeast Water didn't have the best end to 2025, and the poor occupants of Tunbridge Wells in particular suffered 9 days with no water to their homes and businesses. But this is not the first time the region has been impacted by this sort of thing. And back in 2022, the weekend before Valentine's weekend, so early February, the beginning of half term, and I'd been at the hotel for about a year by that point, maybe a year and a half, having come out of COVID and all that fun. And on the Friday afternoon, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, obviously, we lost all our incoming water supply. Now, I've not been through this situation before. I had not got a contingency planned, and it took us all by surprise. And as a spa property, especially, we use an awful lot of water. So what followed was 39 hours of no water, which was not pleasant for anybody. But what we tried to do was in terms of fundamentally managing communication to the guest, trying to keep them informed of what the situation, what was happening, what Southeast Water were doing, and what we were doing in the background, with a view to trying to say to them, look, in the next couple of hours this should be back, or we're anticipating this being in the next whatever. What actually transpired, despite the best of intentions, was that Southeast Water didn't know what had happened and they couldn't find the leak. And so despite the information coming down the line to us to say, yeah, engineers are on site, they're fixing it, the engineers weren't on site because they were in the wrong place, looking at the wrong hedge. And consequently, decisions that were being made on site ended up being the wrong decisions, and the guests consequently suffered. Now, there were some things that we did right, and we acted very quickly to shut down the spa facilities, relocate guests and humanity to where we had the largest storage tanks, etc., to try and retain facilities as much as possible in that regard. But what didn't happen in the way that with the benefit of hindsight, should have done, was controlling the decision narrative from on site. We were too reactive in waiting for information to reach us to then assimilate that and make a decision. In reality, what should have happened, and what has happened since, because that's not the only time we've lost water, is to take control of that decision-making process, using a timeline and saying that if by this point we're still without water, or by this time, or whatever it is, then we make decision A or decision B, and making a decision tree that way. And having had no water, it was only 7 hours 2 weekends ago, but having gone through that process again very recently, it was a far smoother experience for everybody, to the point where guests were writing in after the fact to thank us for the way it was handled, rather than writing in to admonish us for ruining their everythings. So I think what what that experience taught me was the power of a what if plan. And it's not about, to come back to an earlier point, it's not about having a massively thick Bible of, right, this is what happens when X goes down.
Mm.
Having the ability and the facility and the strength within the leadership team to create that decision tree and know your key milestones. But because every situation is going to be different and every information flow is going to be different, if you try and box it all into one matrix, like Andreas was saying, then you risk just getting stuck in your own sort of circle.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that, James. Because I'm a big believer that unfortunately it sucks that you had to go through that. It must have been a very high pressured, very stressful time, but you've learned
Most enjoyable weekend, but
but you certainly learned a hell of a lot. And
yes.
the proof is in the pudding that your guests are actually now very hold you in high regard for being able to monitor the situation and deal with it effectively. So congrats.
Thank
you. Michael, there will be some instances where a hotelier will have to make a claim for whatever situation has hit them. So can you just walk us through what actually happens during this process? So what does it look like? Where could it go wrong? And what kind of supporting evidence helps with that claim?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose the claim really will begin before the claim happens. So again, it's a really good idea to do this type of scenario testing. For example, I know it's a grim subject, but a terrorism event, for example, if you make enough time in your C-suite meeting or your board meeting just to kind of talk through the steps, what would happen in this event, and also just scenario test the controls you have in place. If you've got risk transfer in place, so if you bought an insurance policy, you want to make sure it's fit for purpose. And that's the same with terror, property, casualty, cyber. So you want to make sure if malware gets into my system, if I have an event, if I have a leak or a flood, how will the policy respond? And is there any restrictions? For example, excesses on flood, or maybe you were required to back up your data every month on your cyber policy. And they're all practical steps, but you want to make sure that you're compliant. And also, any of the information that you put into your policy is actually what you get out in a claim. So, for example, if I'm declaring my gross profit as a way of that's my loss of income insurance in the event of a business interruption claim, be it cyber or physical, you can include your wages as part of that declaration, and you probably should. But there's no hard and fast rule. You can include trunk, you can include spa services. If you don't get that aspect of the claim. So it's really kind of thinking, what do you want to get out of an unlikely situation or a catastrophe situation? In terms of the practical steps, engage with as many people as you can. In terms of the suppliers that you already have in place. So obviously speak to your broker. Your broker will nominate a loss adjuster. Have a good conversation with the broker to see what information should be prepared. Normally, if it's a business interruption claim, you'll take a year or two before. But it's subjective because you're talking about future loss of profits. So if you engage with stakeholders like Ryan, for example, he's got a wealth of information around data and the other stakeholders in order to prepare your claim to get the most amount of benefit as possible. Likewise, in terms of a casualty claim, so we're talking about employee safety, guest safety as well. There are some situations where there's an unfortunate situation, say a slip in a trip, and you don't feel that you're liable for that. So in order for a claim to happen, you have to prove liability. So if you look at claims defensibility, some very, very simple practical steps, like maybe doing pendulum testing on a floor, a spa area. It's where you have a very simple device, which is basically a string with a piece of rubber to see if the floor surface is slippy or if it needs any remediation. In the event of a slip and trip, if you've done your testing, it's very hard to prove negligence if you're not at fault, that is. So there are practical steps as well. So I'd say it's mostly communication and just having everything pre-prepared. one thing we do for our clients, which is very different to the rest of the market, is we actually have those steps and those conversations in advance of any claims. So we'll make sure loss adjusters are written into the policy, that they match the business. If it's a global, if it's UK only, if it's UK and Ireland, make sure that all the service providers aligned to that contract can go out and actually serve and get the best possible outcome. Because the main thing is obviously getting the operator back in the same place they enjoyed before the loss as quickly as possible. So
Mhm.
if we're all aligned and we're all communicating, insurance is definitely a mechanism that can help align all the stakeholders and get back in that position as quickly as possible. But really, communication's the key.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I'm going to call out to our audience as well because I'm keeping an eye on the time. If you do have any questions for our speakers, please do get in touch. Pop them in the chat, pop them in the Q&A box, and I will get round to asking those wherever I can. Andreas, I'm coming back to yourself because we're very much in the sort of practical stage of this webinar. Like, what do how do things actually play out and what does it actually look like? And I want to talk to you about a robust business continuity plan and what it looks like in practice. And more importantly, how should it actually be used during a disruption?
Yeah, sure. Now I'll maybe say what it's not, right? And I think James hinted at this is right. It's not a plan that sits in a binder on a shelf somewhere that has, every scenario in it, but it's really a kind of a living, breathing playbook that, does a couple of things, right? So who's in charge, right? Who has kind of decision-making authority and who should the people look to? Thinking through kind of prioritizing, as I said, what should stay running. In some cases, what do you need to shut down and shut down quickly to preserve the property, for example. Um, Michael's point around communication, totally agree with that. How do you communicate? Which usually is a pretty high stress environment or can be. And then something that most of us are getting less and less competent at is how do we operate in manual mode? Kind of, yeah, the best example that came to mind is, when you're at the airport and the luggage tags don't come out of a machine but need to be handwritten. What's the process for that? So the luggage actually gets to the hotel at the end of the day. So, to me, there's kind of a couple of different layers. So one is around kind of crisis command. So who's leading on an incident? Who's the backup? Yeah. So you can't have the whole thing stop if the GM's not there. Are there any kind of escalation thresholds where something needs to be dealt with differently? Are people authorized to take ownership? So can they spend money, for example, to resolve an issue or address something that's really urgent? Who do they contact? And very importantly, you know, are we keeping track of the decisions that we're making so we can learn from them later on if the event happened again? And James's point around the second time was still no fun, but probably a lot easier to deal with comes exactly from that. I think then, whilst we don't want to be exhaustive about kind of planning for every eventuality, it is helpful to have some playbooks that are kind of short scenario playbooks or what ifs around that are relevant to your hotel. Yeah, not kind of a theoretical exercise, but what happens if the power goes out? What happens if the PMS or the POS have an outage? What if there is a cyber incident, etc. Flood, fire, water, but also other things that disrupt the business like staff shortages. Yeah, what happens if too many people just don't show up for work? What do you do, right? How do you stay functional? Or what if your suppliers let you down, right? I think that's a big one as well. And then there's a piece around, how do you think about recovery? So if your supplier lets you down, what's your backup supplier, kind of look like? Storing data off-site versus having it on servers. Obviously, much more and more stuff has moved into the cloud, but that's not universally true. I think, how do you go through the process of guest relocation and engaging with them in a meaningful way? And that point, again, James made around, if you get this right, it's actually a service win in a very difficult situation. So lots of points around that. And on the low tech side of things as well, combining that with the comms piece, are you able to communicate in a kind of in an old school way. Yeah, your email's down maybe, or your mobile phone's down. So how do you actually get a message out? So I think that's really important. And then I think there's a big piece around how the plan is used, right? So I'll go back to what I said earlier. The first thing has to be around um, safety and around stabilization. You then kind of shift in your kind of second phase into protecting what's still good. So, and what the essential services look like, ensuring that guests trust what you're doing, even if it's difficult and impacting on them. Do they trust and believe that you're doing the right thing? And protecting cash. Yeah, let's not ever forget that. Yeah, that's what keeps the business going. And then the third piece is around kind of recovery, documenting what's happened and learning from that as well, which I think is kind of critically important. And I think, to me, if I give you a tangible example, right, of how you need to think about this, is this comes down to the network, for example, goes down, communications are impacted. Let's throw on top of that the GM's not there, so they're not on site. So can the people who are on site, can they actually find the plan? If the plan's locked away in the GM's office and nobody can get in, it's not a very useful plan. And then go through kind of a process of, are they able to reach the right people? Are they able to reassure guests and so on? So kind of stepping through some of those issues, and you need to trust and empower your workforce and make sure they have the right tools for that. So lots to think about, lots to do, and there'll be unique scenarios for each one of the properties that we could come up with and talk about.
Thanks, Andreas. Ryan, to bring you back in here, and I'm going to sort of, your question kind of sits quite firmly into what Andreas has just said, and also what Michael referenced earlier around scenario modeling. So I want to ask you, Ryan, about how data can actually support a business continuity plan, and how might it be used in that scenario modeling, and how can that be used in practice so that you're prepared for when you may need to use a business continuity plan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the most part, in my personal view anyway, I think it's very easy to get to a place where you say that the role of data is, to try to forecast whatever that next disruption might be. But I think it's actually can be used, it's more likely to be used both ways. The data is a test for you to make sure that your business is able to kind of understand what your pressure points are, how tolerant are you, whether the market goes one way or the other way, and then that response plan that comes in. Because in when you try to take an approach like various scenario planning, I think all of us have maybe gone through our heads, and part of the reason that we're in, we love the hospitality industry is, you look at the news and every single headline that comes in is every single one of those headlines affects hospitality in one way or another, whether it's to do with something to do with disposable income or something to do with travel or something to do with traffic or something. Every single part of most part of the news cycle affects hospitality. So suddenly you can find yourself in a place where you've got a million different scenarios that can come into play. But I think that the key ones are, really just trying to, of course, understand how you measure versus your comp set, and then really breaking that down into the P&L. What I've noticed when I look at our kind of year-to-date data, for example, is in the UK in particular, year to date, we saw something like a 7% increase in the reserve for capital replacement. So your replacement reserve typically in your P&L, which is mainly associated with, your roof fell down or something like that kind of style of problem that may well happen. So we've seen definitely an increase in that. The challenge, of course, also comes with the increase in labor costs, the increase in costs across the board, something like 70% year to date up from in terms of utilities across the UK, and that's from some of the data that we've collected. But I think that it's all of those bits. If I had to leave a comment, I mean, I listened to a really interesting panel at IHIF recently, which was with Pygmalion and Accor, and they had UBM Development and Radisson. And there was an interesting tagline that kind of came out, which was that like, flexible future-proofing is like the new marathon training. You're constantly trying to future-proof what you're doing all the time? And then what costs can you look to tighten? And I think in a moment where you have some isolationism when it comes to operator, brand, owner, those looking to protect themselves in various ways, but I think that certainly more collaboration comes from those. And when you think about the how do you design that flexibility into your process, whether it's technology, sustainability being a big key part of that, and getting all the right certification from a sustainability perspective means that you will already be doing a lot of the work that's required to do that future proofing in order to gain a lot of that certification. So yeah, having a little bit more collaboration between the pieces, but there is so many moving parts. But of course, there's, you know, the typical ones to track: occupancy, RevPAR, GoPAR, labor cost per available room. What does that do all the way down to your net income?
Mhm. Thanks, Ryan. I am going to head back over to Michael, and I'm going to add in a question from the audience, because I know, Michael, you touched on the grim reality of what a terrorism incident it might happen. So to begin with, Michael, what are the most common claim scenarios you see, and what do they reveal about how well prepared those hotels were? And then we'll bring in the question from the audience.
So if we look at if we take a fresh pair of eyes review of an insurance program, say it's new to Howden, the first thing we look for is attritional losses. So we can see if if you've got say if you've got 50 hotels and you can see a high attritional liability risk, you can see it's not as well managed as it should be. So certainly from an attritional point of view, slips and trips are always number one. As I say, they can be risk managed out of the business to a large degree by taking, by having a good risk management program and engaging with the right stakeholders. So that'll be your external consultants, but it should also be your insurance company and broker, because they can help with a lot. There's a lot of value added stuff in the background that you might not even be aware that you have. We see it a lot in cyber. So a lot of the cyber policies, most cyber insurance companies employ more cybersecurity experts than they do underwriters, because they're constantly, battling with hackers, trying to protect the clients, obviously trying to reduce their own loss ratios. So there's a lot of extras available to the hotelier that they might not be aware that they actually have in place already. So in terms of the most common scenarios, slips and trips in terms of casualty, escape of water is still number one. So even if you have a small fire, if two engines come along to put that small fire out, the drying time on that property is high, and that's what pushes the business interruption claim up. So in terms of severity, we see escape water still being number one for hotels, even if it's connected to something else. So normally it's connected to a small fire. If it's a flooding event, obviously it's got equal severity there as well. There's various different things you can do to try and mitigate loss before it occurs. In respect to terrorism, terrorism is an interest. So we've done a lot of content around Martin's Law, and what the one biggest takeaway I would have is just make sure the cover's right, because with the introduction of Martin's Law, you've basically pushed the responsibility from the government over to the operator for certain venues. Basically, every single hotel in the UK has enhanced requirements. Is not being a fine yet. It's not to say that we don't know how the government's going to react to the first one, and the enforcement authorities. So it's important just to make sure that where we've seen, if you have a £10 million limit via a primary policy and various excess layers, a lot of the inner limits for terrorism are like 1 million, 2 million, and they don't attach properly. So like really simple steps that go back to that, good robust BCP and scenario testing to say, okay, in the event, what are we going to do? Obviously, how are we going to maintain staff safety, which is the most important thing, guest safety important, but also what would how would we be compensated in the event of an incident? So it's just making sure that those policies are correct. We're getting a lot of questions about Dubai as well. Obviously UAE, do the terrorism policies that we place in the UAE, do they extend to terrorism? Which is obviously an interesting question, because it's not a full, it hasn't been declared an act of war, and the Iranian government are basically a terrorism organization. So that's been an interesting query that's come up. And then going back to, is the cover fit for purpose? Sometimes, there isn't enough cover in place and it needs to be enhanced, but it's usually best to ask the question before the loss occurs.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Michael, and appreciate you talking about that, because the question from the audience is, how do you see Martin's Law impacting operational resilience? So I think you've raised some good points there.
Yeah, I think the main thing is just to do your risk assessment, and as long as you have a competent person, Howden do have alignment with third parties who can do those risk assessments. But also, there's going to be a lot of people in the market trying to sell unwanted services. So, you don't have to have bomb-proof windows in every aspect of the build. Every building's going to have its own unique requirements, and you can fall into the trap of spending too much and spending too much time on this as well. At the end of the day, it's an extra cost to hotels. It's one of those extra things that is just loading up on the hospitality sector. But if you get the right information, hopefully it's not going to be too onerous on the business. But the main thing is, because the risk is now transferred from government to operator, just make sure if you do have a terrorism policy that it's correct and it has the right attachment point. Just ask your broker, because they'll be able to say, what limit do I have for Martin's Law? And they'll have to come back and confirm that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Michael.
No problem.
James, I'm going to come back to you. And you've sort of answered my next question, which was, what actually works in practice when you're under pressure and need to act quickly? I think you've highlighted that having a plan, if plan A doesn't pan out, then we move to plan B, and if we get to this certain point in the timeline, then we need to move on. So I won't dwell on that too much, but of course, feel free to chime in should you wish to. But it's been talked a lot today about communication and who is actually responsible for making those decisions when a situation occurs. And so that's what I'm more keen to hear from you today, James, is who is responsible for making those decisions, and does that actually change in reality when a quick decision needs to be made?
Sure. So, who's responsible for making decisions? I suppose the most encompassing answer for that will generally come down to who is the most senior person on site. Right? Generally speaking, it's going to be your GM, or maybe your hotel or your operations manager, or if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, then your night manager or your DM or whomever. So I think who is responsible for making decisions is a fairly straightforward one. It's the most senior relevant person who's on site. What the where sort of the opportunity for grey lies with that is during the escalations process. Right. And so at what point does that person need to escalate, bring in another level? At what point is it okay or necessary to then call the GM and say, look, you need to be here now because there's decisions having to be made that are whatever. So making sure you've got a clear understanding of that. If in our business, I generally operate on the basis that if I'm not there, then the time that you absolutely need to get to me is if there's a decision to be made about future business. So if we're talking about, say, closing the spa for the next day, and there's going to be knock-on business to the future, then make sure I'm there at that decision-making point. Up to then, you're in the sort of critical moment, and you're going to be dealing with sort of the minutiae, the face-to-face decisions, which come as part of being a senior manager in the operation anyway. I would expect to be aware of it, but I'm not necessarily going to be expecting to be referred back to. No.
Mhm.
So I think having a crystallized sort of escalation tree is the most important point for clarity on that.
Hmm. And Michael, a quick one for you around what actually separates those well-managed responses from those that might lead to a more complex or perhaps even a costly claim?
Um, I would say it's planning. You know, again, if your communication strategy is good and you've thought about these events before they've occurred, and you have a good communication plan in place, as Andrea said earlier, you know, it makes everything a lot easier. For example, if you did have an operational claim, the first thing you'd want to maintain is your cash flow. So if this is a catastrophe BCP event which falls into the risk transfer bucket, whereby you have a policy that fits, um, how quickly can I get my interim payments? Well, that'll come back to, you know, how quickly can we mobilize the team to provide the information required. Sometimes the team aren't able to do it, so you know, an external forensic accountant that you're friendly with or has been written into the policy is helpful, particularly for larger losses. But if we know exactly what steps we're going to take before the event happens, it's a lot easier. So, for example, loss adjuster written into the policy, we know exactly what loss adjuster is going to attend that site in either, you know, in Kent, in Glasgow, wherever it might be, and that we can put boots on the ground quickly. But also in terms of calculating the business interruption, if I've already seen your P&L, I can give you a template and we can work towards that, or it might be a format that you're comfortable with. So if we can get the information quickly and obviously speak to various different stakeholders, including Ryan, for example, or somebody who has large data sets, so we can you know we can put different projections in place that might impact the numbers, present the picture to the insurers. Hopefully, if everything makes sense, the insurers will agree an interim payment. So if you've got £1 million loss, you don't have to wait until the end of that claim because your cash flow is required now. You might want 100k here and there towards completion before full and final settlement. So certainly, all the hard work happens before the event.
Mm. And finally, I want to you've just touched on P&L there, Michael, and I know
Mhm.
Ryan, you actually mentioned earlier that you've seen an increase in reserves. It's now about 7%. But Andreas, your thoughts around how much financial runway should a hotel realistically hold to help weather any kind of serious disruption?
Like any good consultant, I'll answer that with it depends. But given the fact that you won't let me off that easily, I think you could use a practical benchmark that kind of says um, that every hotel should really have immediate access to liquidity for at least 90 days of kind of what I describe as stress kind of fixed cash burn. And lots of assets need more than that, right? So higher risk assets that maybe are more complex to operate. So I guess drawing that comparison of the 3 months versus 6 months, if the 3 months is looking at kind of a limited service city center hotel that has different demand generators that can recover more quickly, etc., you might be able to get away with 3 months. Whereas if you're talking about a resort or a seasonal hotel or somebody that has an ownership structure with a big rent payment in there that might not be deferred and so on. So that's why it genuinely it does depend. But I think especially in the more kind of complex assets, anything below 6 months starts raising some concerns. Now, we operate in a sector where there's a lot of independently owned hotels, a lot of family owned hotels. Is that a realistic target for all of them? Maybe not, but that just, changes the risk profile around kind of how they might trade going forward. And I think the other point that I would highlight is that sometimes people only think about, the financial requirement whilst this disruption is happening, but obviously it extends back into the ramp up period as well as you rebuild the business and it's not operating at 100% yet. You might still be going through repairs, et cetera, et cetera. So think about that 3 or 6 month period, not just as the specific time of the disruption, but the follow-on effects as well.
Good point, Andreas. I'm taking a look at the time and we have run out. There was so much more we could have dived into today. So, Andreas, Ryan, Michael, James, thank you so much for your time and contributions. And we're going to keep this webinar open for a couple of minutes at the end, just to allow our audience members time to follow up on any of the links that we've popped into the chat, including the profile of our speakers today. So do connect, ask your questions in private should you wish. Just some closing slides that I would like to run through. We talked a little bit about policy shifts and how some policy shifts might be shaping how hotels operate. Our next webinar, taking place later this summer in June, is going to explore the potential tourist tax that could be implemented in England and what hospitality operators need to know. So we're going to be looking at how hotels are performing in Amsterdam. We're going to be looking at what's happening in Edinburgh, just with a view that we can refine this and just understand what the lay of the land could look like. So would love for you to join in. The link to register for that webinar has been popped into the chat. And if you're curious in learning more about us and working with us, do get in touch with my colleague Katie. Her details are on your screen and also popped into the chat. And if you're keen to learn more about Howden and how Howden can support your business, get in touch with Michael. His details are also on your screen and also popped into the chat there. So once again, thanks so much to Howden for their support in pulling this webinar together. Once again, thank you to our expert panelists. Looking forward to seeing you all soon on June the 22nd. But until then, take care, folks, and I'll see you all soon. Bye now.
At IHM, we believe in the power of connection. We exist to inspire, to inform, and to unite decision makers who are shaping the future of hospitality and real estate. Our why is simple. We believe this industry thrives when people and ideas come together. And we're here to make that happen. So how do we do it? We publish 4 leading multimedia brands, each a trusted voice in its sector. We blend intelligent content, curated events, and a strong community into everything we do, making it easy, accessible, and genuinely useful. From online engagement to face-to-face connection, we are known for being insightful, collaborative, and refreshingly human. We host world-class events, panel discussions, podcasts, award ceremonies, and webinars designed to spark ideas, drive conversation, and create impact. With over 62,000 monthly web visitors, 55,000 email subscribers, and 69,000 social media connections. Our reach is deep and our community is active. We're partnered with the biggest names in hospitality, and we'd love to connect with you. So whether you're looking to grow your visibility, meet the right people, or understand where the market's heading, read, watch, listen, and me. Do it all with IHM.